Picture this: you're trapped in a dimly lit dungeon, the cold stone walls pressing in around you, the distant echo of guards' footsteps, a constant reminder of your captivity. Your armor, once a symbol of honor, now feels like a cage. This was the reality for countless knights during the occupied wars of the medieval era, when capture didn't always mean the end of the story. In fact, some of history's most astonishing tales of survival and cunning come from these very moments where knights turned desperation into daring escapes that defied all odds. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on these incredible feats, uncovering the strategies, the luck, and the sheer audacity that allowed these warriors to slip through the grasp of their enemies and return to the fight. What does it take to escape when every door is locked, every guard is watching, and failure means certain doom? The answer lies in a mix of ingenuity, bravery, and sometimes pure unpredictability. Some knights relied on hidden tunnels, painstakingly dug over months beneath their captors' feet. Others forged unlikely alliances, turning enemies into accomplices with nothing but words and wit. And then there were those who simply waited patiently, relentlessly, for the one moment when their captor's attention wavered, seizing it with lightning speed. These stories aren't just about physical strength, they're about the unbreakable human spirit, the refusal to accept defeat even when the situation seems hopeless. As we journey through these tales, you'll discover how these escapes shaped the course of battles and even entire wars. You'll meet the unsung heroes, the scribes who smuggled messages, the peasants who risked their lives to guide knights to safety, the rival commanders who secretly admired their prisoners' resolve. This isn't just a collection of historical footnotes, it's a testament to what people can achieve when pushed to their limits. So settle in, because what follows is a gripping exploration of courage, resourcefulness, and the relentless will to survive. By the end, you'll never look at the medieval world or the idea of captivity the same way again. Being taken prisoner as a knight was nothing like the chivalrous stories of honorable surrender. The moment those iron gates clanged shut behind them, these warriors faced a brutal reality. Forget spacious towers or genteel captivity, many were thrown into damp, rat-infested dungeons, their armor stripped away, their identities reduced to bargaining chips in a high-stakes game of ransom and politics. Noble blood didn't spare them from starvation, disease, or the whims of vengeful captors. For every knight held for profit, another might face a swift execution, their fate decided by the shifting tides of war or personal grudges. Yet even in those darkest hours, something remarkable happened. The very training that made them formidable fighters, discipline, strategic thinking, unwavering focus, became their lifeline. Imprisonment wasn't just a test of physical strength, it was a mental battlefield. Knights memorized guard rotations, studied weaknesses in fortress layouts, and even learned snippets of their captors' languages to eavesdrop on crucial conversations. Some turned their isolation into opportunity, using months of confinement to plan escapes down to the smallest detail. Others relied on sheer adaptability, improvising tools from scraps or forging alliances with fellow prisoners. What's truly striking is how these moments of captivity reveal the human side of these legendary figures. Behind the armor, they weren't invincible. They were men pushed to their limits, grappling with fear, boredom, and the crushing weight of uncertainty. Their defiance wasn't just about fleeing, it was a refusal to let their spirit be broken. When a knight carved a makeshift key from bone or lowered himself from a tower using torn bedsheets, he wasn't just escaping a prison. He was reclaiming his destiny. This context makes their escapes all the more extraordinary. These weren't impulsive dashes for freedom. but calculated acts of rebellion against a system designed to crush hope. Every successful escape sent a ripple through the medieval world, proof that even the most fortified strongholds had vulnerabilities, and that courage could outmaneuver cruelty. So before we dive into the ingenious methods they used, remember, each of these stories begins with a choice, whispered in the dark, to fight back. One of the most effective escape strategies relied not on brute force, but on a knight's ability to read the room literally. Behind those iron bars, the sharpest weapon wasn't a hidden blade, but a keen eye for human weakness. Imagine a knight, day after day, silently cataloging every detail. The guard who always nodded off after his noon meal, the younger sentry who lingered too long gossiping at shift change, the predictable gaps in patrol routes where shadows stretched just a little longer. These weren't just observations, they were lifelines. Take the case of Sir William de Morisco, imprisoned in a Welsh stronghold in the 13th century. By pretending to suffer from a wasting illness, he convinced his captors he was too feeble to pose a threat. Guards grew lax, leaving his cell door ajar as they delivered meager rations. What they didn't realize, his trembling hands were timing their movements. The moment a drunken celebration left the night watch on demand, he slipped through the castle's underbelly like a shadow, using a rusted spoon to pick the lock of a forgotten storeroom leading to freedom. Bribery played its part too, but not always with gold. Knights often traded something far more valuable, future favors, a promise to spare a guard's village in the next campaign, or to recommend a lowborn jailer for a royal pardon, could loosen chains faster than a blacksmith's tools. The cleverest prisoners turned their captors' greed against them, dangling the illusion of reward while quietly unraveling their own captivity. What made these tactics work wasn't just cunning, it was the art of playing the long game. Escape wasn't a single dramatic leap over the walls, but 100 tiny victories, a whispered conversation here, a memorized keyhole shape there. These knights understood that patience was their ally, and that every moment spent studying their enemy was an investment in freedom. Their stories remind us that even in confinement, the mind remains the most unbreakable weapon. But sometimes the boldest escape wasn't about hiding in shadows, it was about disappearing in plain sight. Imagine a knight stripped of his gleaming armor, trading it for the rough spun tunic of a peasant or even the flowing robes of a merchant's wife. Disguise wasn't just a costume, it was a performance, demanding every ounce of a prisoner's wit and observation. The most successful escapees didn't just dress the part, they became it, mastering the slump of a laborer's shoulders or the sing-song cadence of a local dialect. Take the case of Sir Reginald de Warenne, captured during the French occupation of Normandy in the 14th century. After months in a cramped cell, he noticed how the castle's laundresses moved freely through the gates, their faces obscured by baskets of linen. Using a rusted nail to shear his distinctive blonde hair and charcoal to smudge his features, he folded himself into their ranks, mimicking their weary gait so perfectly that guards barely glanced his way. By the time his absence was discovered, he was already halfway to the coast, his once familiar face now just another anonymous traveler on a dusty road. Disguises required more than just visual deception. A knight's hands, hardened by years of swordplay, could betray him in an instant. Some rubbed dirt into their palms to mimic calluses from farm tools, while others practiced the fumbling gestures of a beggar to avoid suspicion. Language was another minefield. A single mispronounced word could unravel the entire ruse. The savviest escapees spent their captivity listening intently, absorbing the slang and speech patterns of their captors until they could pass as a local. What makes these stories so compelling isn't just the audacity, but the humility they reveal. These were men raised to stand out, their armor, crests, and titles symbols of pride. Yet in that critical moment, they embraced invisibility, trading status for survival. A disguise wasn't just fabric and dye. It was a psychological surrender, a willingness to erase oneself temporarily to live another day. And in that act, they proved true cunning isn't about dominance, it's about adaptability. The legacy of these escapes lingers in surprising ways. Modern special forces still study these medieval tactics, proving that the art of blending in is as vital today as it was 7 centuries ago. Because when the stakes are high, the most powerful weapon isn't always a sword sometimes. It's the ability to walk right past your enemy without them ever knowing you were there. In the grim solitude of a dungeon, even the proudest knight might discover an uncomfortable truth: no one escapes alone. Behind those towering walls, survival often hinged on something far more fragile than steel: trust. While some prisoners plotted in secrecy, others turned their captivity into a web of alliances, weaving together fellow captives, disgruntled guards, and even sympathetic servants into a lifeline. These covert networks reveal a side of medieval prisons rarely seen in tales of heroism: the quiet, desperate collaborations that blurred the lines between enemy and ally. Consider the story of Sir Thomas de Blundeville, locked away in a French fortress during the 100 Years' War. His cellmate, a Breton mercenary, had no love for their shared captors. Over months of whispered conversations, they realized their fates were intertwined. The Breton knew the castle's hidden passages. Thomas had the nobility to command respect if they reached friendly territory. Together, they staged a fight so convincing that guards rushed in only to be overpowered with stolen keys. Their escape wasn't just a triumph of strength, but of shared purpose between men who, under different circumstances, might have faced each other on the battlefield. Servants, often invisible to their noble captors, became unexpected lifelines. A kitchen maid slipping an extra loaf of bread into a knight's ration might seem insignificant until that bread concealed a nail for picking locks. Stable boys could loosen a horse's girth just enough for a saddled escape, while scribes might misplace a crucial patrol schedule. These weren't random acts of kindness. They were calculated risks by those who stood to gain from a knight's gratitude. A promise of land, protection, or even marriage for a daughter could turn a lowly worker into the most valuable conspirator. Even guards weren't immune to persuasion. The cleverest prisoners played on their jailers' grievances: a missed promotion, unpaid wages, or a simmering feud with a superior. In one astonishing case, a Spanish knight imprisoned by Moorish forces learned enough Arabic to recite poetry to his homesick guard, bonding over verses about distant families. When the time came, that guard looked the other way as the knight melted into the night. What makes these alliances so remarkable is their fragility. A single slip of the tongue, a change of heart, or a higher bid from the enemy could collapse everything. Yet time and again, knights gambled on these human connections, proving that in the chess game of escape, sometimes the most powerful piece wasn't a lone queen, but a row of pawns moving together. These stories remind us that behind every great escape, there were often unsung heroes, the ones who chose against all odds to help rather than hinder. And in doing so, they rewrote history, one whispered pact at a time. The walls of a prison might silence a knight's voice, but they couldn't stop his words from finding a way out. In the shadows of captivity, communication became its own form of rebellion, a silent war waged with ink, thread, and even the flight of a bird. Imagine a scrap of parchment tucked inside a loaf of bread, its edges browned by the oven, bearing plans that could turn the tide of a war. Or a tapestry hanging innocently in a castle hall, its stitches subtly altered to reveal troop movements to anyone who knew how to look. These weren't just messages, They were lifelines woven into the fabric of everyday life right under the noses of unsuspecting guards. Some of the most ingenious methods relied on the ordinary becoming extraordinary. Sir Geoffrey de Charny, held prisoner after the Battle of Poitiers, used his skill at chess to pass coded moves to a fellow captive, each piece's position corresponding to a letter, each game a covert conversation. Others wrote between the lines of seemingly pious letters home, their ink made from soot and wine, their words bland enough to avoid suspicion but rich with meaning for those who knew the cipher. Even the humble embroidery needle became a tool of espionage, as noblewomen stitched hidden pleas for rescue into the very garments sent to launderers. But perhaps the most daring communications came on wings. Falcons and carrier pigeons, trained to return to specific lofts, became the medieval equivalent of encrypted radio signals. A knight might release a bird during a courtyard walk, its tiny leg bearing a message rolled tighter than a blade of grass. The risk was immense. Intercepted notes meant torture or death, yet the reward was worth it. Coordination with outside allies, plans for attack, or simply the morale boost of knowing they hadn't been forgotten. What's striking about these methods isn't just their creativity, but their psychological brilliance. Every smuggled note, every coded stitch, was a defiance of the isolation that prisons sought to impose. These knights transformed their captivity into a node in a vast, invisible network, proving that even the most fortified dungeons had leaks. Their stories remind us that communication isn't just about words, it's about connection. And in the face of oppression, that connection can become the sharpest weapon of all. Beneath the feet of unsuspecting guards, in the damp earth where torchlight never reached, some knights waged their most patient battle, the slow, back-breaking work of carving freedom from stone. Tunneling wasn't just about brute strength, it was a test of endurance, a silent rebellion measured in inches. Imagine a knight hunched in a cramped crevice, scraping at mortar with a stolen spoon or a rusted belt buckle, his hands raw and bleeding, every scrape echoing dangerously through the hollows of the castle's foundation. One wrong move, one dislodged rock, and the entire plan could collapse literally. The logistics were staggering. Without modern tools, prisoners relied on whatever they could scavenge. A broken hinge repurposed as a chisel, a bone from their meager rations sharpened into a digging pick. Some used their drinking cups to scoop away loose soil, hiding the evidence in their straw mattresses or even flushing it through cracks in the floor during rainstorms. The most ingenious escapees reinforced their tunnels with stolen bed slats or scraps of armor to prevent cave-ins, turning their prisons into makeshift engineering projects. But the real challenge wasn't just digging, it was knowing where to dig. A tunnel leading straight into a guard barracks was as good as a death sentence. Knights studied every sound, the drip of water that might hint at a sewer line, the distant chatter of servants that revealed an outer courtyard's location. In one remarkable case, a Flemish knight imprisoned in an English fortress noticed rats consistently scurrying toward a particular wall. Following their path, he uncovered a collapsed medieval drain, its ancient stones loose enough to pry apart. 3 months later, he emerged into the moat covered in filth but gloriously free. Secret passages offered another lifeline, if a prisoner could find them. Castles were riddled with hidden corridors designed for servants or emergencies, often forgotten over time. A loose stone in a cell wall might conceal a spiral staircase leading to the chapel. A rusted sconce could twist open to reveal a narrow escape route. The luckiest captives stumbled upon these by accident, like the German knight who, while pacing his cell, dislodged a floorboard revealing a chute used to dispose of refuse. It led straight to the riverbank where he vanished into the night under a cloak of floating debris. What makes these escapes extraordinary isn't just the physical feat. but the psychological resilience behind them. Unlike a bold disguise or a bribed guard, tunneling demanded relentless hope. Progress was measured in grains of sand, each day testing whether a man's will could outlast his captor's vigilance. And when that final stone was pulled away, when cool night air rushed into the tunnel's end, it wasn't just a path to freedom, it was proof that even the mightiest walls could be undone, one whisper of scraping metal at a time. Sometimes the key to slipping through enemy hands wasn't stealth, it was spectacle. Knights trapped behind enemy lines mastered the art of controlled chaos, turning their prisons into stages for carefully crafted performances. A sudden fire in the barracks, a staged brawl between prisoners, or even a faked seizure in the courtyard, these weren't random acts of desperation. They were precision-timed distractions designed to pull every pair of eyes away from the one place that mattered, the path to freedom. Take the escape of Sir Robert de Vere from a Burgundian dungeon in the 15th century. Knowing guards would react to the scent of smoke, he used a stolen candle to ignite a pile of straw near the armory, far enough from his cell to avoid suspicion, but close enough to trigger panic. As soldiers scrambled to douse the flames, he simply walked out the open gate, disguised as a bucket-carrying townsman drawn to the commotion. The brilliance lay in the details. The fire was large enough to demand attention, but small enough to avoid triggering a full lockdown. Other knights exploited the natural tension within prisons. Two captives might stage a vicious fight, drawing guards into the cell to break it up, while a third, unnoticed, slipped into the now unwatched corridor. The best performers even turned their own bodies into tools of deception. One Flemish knight, held by English forces, collapsed during a courtyard exercise, convulsing dramatically until a crowd gathered. In the confusion, his cellmate vanished, using the distraction to scale a poorly guarded section of the wall. What made these tactics work wasn't just creativity, it was psychology. Guards, no matter how disciplined, were human. A shouted alarm or the crash of breaking pottery triggered instinctive reactions, narrowing their focus to the immediate threat. The smartest escapees didn't just create noise, they engineered emergencies that played on their captors' training. A well-placed shout of "rebellion in the East Wing" could empty an entire block of sentries, all rushing toward a threat that didn't exist. Yet the risks were immense. A diversion that failed to captivate might earn a knight tighter shackles or worse. Timing had to be flawless, with every player in the drama knowing their role. The true masters of this art understood that the best escapes weren't just about fleeing. They were about directing the scene, ensuring that when the curtain fell, the audience never even realized the lead actor had left the stage. These stories remind us that in the game of captivity, chaos wasn't the enemy, it was a tool. And for the knights who wielded it best, a few moments of calculated bedlam could rewrite an entire story of imprisonment into one of liberation. In the shadowy world of medieval captivity, gold often spoke louder than swords, but only if you knew how to whisper its language. Bribery wasn't as simple as tossing coins at a guard. It was a delicate dance of negotiation, timing, and reading the desperation in another man's eyes. Knights held a unique advantage here. Their noble status meant they could promise more than just money, land, titles. Even political influence became bargaining chips in the high-stakes game of freedom. A low-born jailer might dream of lifting his family out of poverty, while a disgruntled officer could be swayed by the prospect of a pardon or promotion. The art lay in offering just enough to tempt, but not so much that it aroused suspicion. Consider the case of Sir John de Sully, captured during the Scottish Wars of Independence. Locked in a bleak tower, he noticed his guards' lingering glances at a silver-chased dagger on the warden's belt. Over weeks of casual conversation, Sully learned the man's daughter was to be married without a dowry. A discreet promise of a gilded cup lost in the next supply cart secured his freedom. The brilliance, the bribe wasn't for the guard's greed, but his love. That cup became a daughter's future, and Sully walked free at dawn, disguised as a woodcutter. Yet for every successful bribe, there were a dozen that backfired. The gravest danger wasn't refusal, it was betrayal. A guard might take the gold, then report the attempt to his superiors for extra reward. Some knights countered this by staging multiple bribes simultaneously, creating confusion about who was truly complicit. Others exploited rivalries within the prison hierarchy, ensuring the bribed guard had more to lose by confessing than by staying silent. The savviest prisoners even turned the tables, planting false evidence of bribery on hostile jailers to get them removed from duty. What's fascinating is how these transactions reveal the cracks in medieval power structures. A castle might seem impregnable, but its human elements, the underpaid sentry, the homesick squire, the jealous lieutenant, were its vulnerabilities. Knights didn't just buy their freedom, they exposed the fragile alliances holding their captors' world together. Every whispered deal was a reminder that loyalty had its price, and that even the strongest chains could be undone by the right combination of gold and psychology. The legacy of these escapes lingers in unexpected ways. Modern hostage negotiators still study medieval bribery tactics, not for their ethics, but for their insight into human motivation. Because whether in the 14th century or the 21st, one truth remains. When liberty hangs in the balance, understanding what drives a person can be far more valuable than any treasure. For all their training in swordplay and mounted combat, knights facing captivity had to master an entirely different discipline, the art of moving like a shadow. Scaling sheer castle walls demanded fingers strong enough to grip crumbling mortar, legs capable of pressing against stone for hours, and a stillness that defied the trembling of exhausted muscles. Swimming a moat wasn't just about endurance, it was about slicing through black water without a ripple, armor discarded but lungs disciplined to endure the cold shock of a midnight plunge. These were feats that turned the human body into an instrument of precision, every muscle honed not for glory but for silence. The most legendary escapes read like impossible athletic triumphs. Take Sir James Douglas, imprisoned in a Scottish stronghold during the Wars of Independence. Guards boasted the outer walls were unscalable, 30 feet of smooth stone. But Douglas had spent his captivity studying the one flaw in their design, a corner where two walls met, creating a narrow crevice just wide enough for fingertips and toes. Over 3 agonizing nights, he inched upward, barefoot to mute sound, his body pressed so tightly against the stone that dawn light revealed streaks of his own blood left in the mortar. His reward, a 20-foot drop into a thicket of brambles and freedom. Water posed its own brutal challenges. Some knights survived moats by filling their boots with air to use as makeshift floats, while others learned to exhale slowly to avoid telltale bubbles. The cleverest timed their escapes to winter, when frozen moats could bear weight if one dared to test the ice's thickness with each step. And then there were the gaps, drainage culverts barely wider than a man's shoulders, often clogged with filth. Squeezing through meant exhaling completely to shrink the ribcage, wriggling forward inch by inch with the stench of sewage thick in the nostrils. What's astonishing isn't just the physicality, but the mental fortitude behind it. A knight trained to charge into battle now had to embrace patience holding a handst and against a wall until guards passed, or floating motionless in a cesspit for hours. These escapes required a paradoxical blend of explosive power and absolute control, where a single misjudged breath could mean discovery. Modern parkour athletes might recognize these medieval techniques, the way a body can become both tool and weapon when pushed to its limits. But unlike today's practitioners, these knights had no safety nets, no second chances. Their feats weren't performed for applause, but for survival, written not in record books, but in the quiet relief of a moonlit forest beyond the walls. And in that silence, they proved that sometimes the greatest strength isn't in striking a blow, but in vanishing without a sound. A knight's greatest weapon wasn't always steel sometimes, it was the subtle art of deception. Psychological warfare turned captivity into a chess match, where every word, every gesture could be a move toward freedom. Imagine a nobleman bowing his head in false submission, praising his captors with a smile while quietly memorizing the rhythm of the changing guard. This wasn't just survival, it was strategy, a deliberate reshaping of reality to serve one purpose: escape. Sir Godfrey de Bouillon, captured during the siege of Antioch, perfected this game. He spent months convincing his Saracen jailers he'd embraced their cause, even learning their prayers to feign conversion. The ruse bought him privileges, more time in the courtyard, access to writing materials. What his captors didn't realize, those prayers contained coded messages to allies outside, and those courtyard walks mapped every weak point in the fortress. By the time he vanished during a sandstorm, his guards were still assuring each other of his loyalty. Rumors became another lethal tool. A clever prisoner might whisper that a certain guard was skimming ransom money, or that the castle's commander planned to betray his own men. These lies, carefully seeded, could unravel discipline faster than any siege engine. In one notorious case, a French knight stoked a feud between two rival guard captains until they came to blows, distracting the entire garrison long enough for 3 prisoners to lower themselves from the walls on knotted ropes. But the most profound battles were internal. Solitary confinement broke men faster than torture, so knights developed mental disciplines to stay sharp. Some recited epic poems to preserve their sanity. Others marked time by scratching tallies into their skin. The resilient ones turned isolation into advantage, using the silence to plan every detail of their escape, rehearsing it in their minds until it felt inevitable. What made these tactics so effective was their invisibility. Unlike a tunnel or disguise, psychological warfare left no physical trace, just a growing unease among captors, a sense that their prisoner was somehow always one step ahead. These knights understood a fundamental truth: control the narrative and you control your fate. Their stories remind us that the strongest chains are often the ones we place on our own minds, and that the first true escape is always the decision to refuse defeat. A knight trapped behind enemy walls wasn't always alone sometimes. His greatest hope lay in the hands of those outside. Beyond the dungeons and battlements, a secret network of allies could be working tirelessly to orchestrate his freedom. Wives disguised as pilgrims delivering Bibles with hollowed-out spines containing lockpicks, merchants embedding maps into the stitching of traded goods, even rival nobles sending coded messages under the guise of ransom negotiations. These were the unsung architects of some of history's most audacious prison breaks. Take the escape of Sir Hugh de Cressingham from a Scottish castle in the late 13th century. His wife, Lady Elena, didn't just plead for his release, she turned her grief into strategy. Knowing the castle's chaplain had ties to her family, she arranged for him to accidentally drop a prayer book near Hugh's cell. Inside, pressed between psalms, were wax impressions of the gate keys. By the time guards realized their prisoner had vanished, Hugh was already aboard a fishing boat disguised as a wool trader, his face smudged with soot from the very hearth where his allies had melted and molded the stolen keys. Local communities played a surprising role too. Peasants, often dismissed as powerless, became lifelines. A farmer might forget a scythe near a prisoner working in the fields, or a baker could slip a coin into a loaf, not just as charity but as an investment. A freed knight might later spare that village from raids or reward a family with protection. In one documented case, a group of children playing near a prison tower distracted guards by staging a mock battle, allowing a captive to lower himself on a rope woven from their mother's laundry lines. Even enemy factions weren't monolithic. A guard might secretly admire a prisoner's resilience, or a low-ranking soldier might resent his own commander enough to aid an escape. The key was identifying these fractures. Sir Bertrand du Guesclin, held by the English during the 100 Years' War, won over a homesick squire by reminiscing about the boy's hometown, a conversation that later earned him a smuggled file hidden in a loaf of bread. These stories reveal a truth often lost in tales of solitary heroism. No knight escaped in a vacuum. Behind every vanished prisoner, there were dozens of hands, some willing, some bribed, some unwitting. That formed a chain of complicity stretching far beyond the dungeon walls. The most successful rescues weren't just acts of bravery. They were feats of coordination where a noble's gold, a merchant's cunning, and a peasant's silent defiance could weave together into a lifeline. And in that collaboration, they exposed the fragile illusion of absolute control, proving that even the mightiest fortress was no match for the quiet determination of those outside its gates. A knight's survival often hinged not on the weapons he carried into battle, but on what he could fashion from the scraps of his captivity. Picture a rusted spoon, bent and sharpened against stone until its edge could pry loose mortar. A belt unraveled thread by thread, transformed into a braided rope strong enough to bear a man's weight. Even a discarded chicken bone, whittled to a point, became a lockpick capable of turning tumblers with painstaking precision. In the hands of a determined prisoner, the most mundane objects morphed into instruments of liberation, proof that creativity could thrive even in the bleakest confines. The brilliance of these improvisations lay in their invisibility. Guards meticulously searched for smuggled blades or ropes, but who would suspect the wooden bowl used for gruel? Sir Richard de Clare, imprisoned in a Welsh castle during the 12th century, hollowed out his bread loaf daily, packing the crumbs into a hidden compartment in his straw mattress. Over weeks, he amassed enough flour paste to mold into a crude adhesive, using it to stick pebbles into the mortar gaps of his cell wall, creating footholds for a moonlit climb. His captors never noticed the missing grains, nor the slow erosion of their fortress's integrity. Some tools served dual purposes, their true function concealed beneath apparent harmlessness. A prisoner's rosary beads might seem like a pious comfort until their wire links were straightened into lock probes. The wax from devotional candles, softened by body heat, could capture the impression of a key left carelessly on a table. Even the iron rivets from a pair of boots, pried loose and sharpened against stone, became daggers in the dark. The most resourceful knights treated every object as a potential puzzle piece, their minds constantly rearranging possibilities like a blacksmith reforging scrap metal. What elevates these stories beyond mere ingenuity is the psychology behind them. A spoon wasn't just a digging tool, it was a rebellion against the very idea of helplessness. By repurposing the items meant to sustain their captivity, these knights symbolically reclaimed agency. Every scratch in the mortar, every frayed thread of a repurposed tunic whispered the same defiant truth, that no prison could fully extinguish the human capacity to reimagine, adapt, and overcome. Modern survival experts still teach these medieval techniques, proving that the principles transcend time. Because when freedom hangs in the balance, the greatest tool isn't always what you're given, it's what you dare to create from the fragments of your constraints. And in those quiet acts of transformation, these knights demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the ability to see not what an object is, but what it could become. The clamor of a festival wasn't just noise to a captive knight, It was camouflage, a symphony of distraction masking the scrape of a loosened bar or the creak of a hidden door. Across medieval Europe, feasts and holy days became unexpected allies for prisoners, their very purpose celebration, weakening the chains of captivity. Wine flowed freely among guards, watch rotations grew lax, and the usual rhythms of prison life dissolved into revelry. For a night plotting escape, these weren't mere moments of opportunity. They were carefully calculated windows where chaos could be harnessed as a weapon. Take the case of Sir Henry Percy, known as Hotspur, imprisoned after a failed rebellion against Henry IV. Held in a Yorkshire stronghold, he bided his time until the Feast of St. John, when the castle's courtyard erupted in bonfires and drunken song. As guards stumbled through torchlit dances, Percy simply walked out the postern gate, his plain cloak blending with the throng of villagers leaving the festivities. The brilliance of his plan lay in its simplicity. No tunnels, no disguises, just the quiet understanding that human nature would do the work for him. A guard who'd spent hours toasting his king's health wasn't likely to scrutinize every shadow. But exploiting celebrations required more than luck. It demanded intimate knowledge of local customs. A knight who knew the exact hour when the May Day revelers would spill into the streets could time his dash to the outer walls perfectly. Others studied religious processions like the Feast of Fools, where societal roles were temporarily inverted. A prisoner might don a jester's motley and vanish into the carnival's madness. The savviest escapees even engineered their own diversions, like the Flemish knight who smuggled in extra ale before a harvest festival, ensuring his jailers would drink themselves into oblivion. What makes these escapes so fascinating is their inversion of power. The very events meant to showcase a castle's wealth and security, the grand banquets, the pious holidays, became its vulnerabilities. A knight didn't need to overpower his captors. He merely had to wait for them to celebrate their own dominance, then slip through the cracks of their overconfidence. These stories remind us that time itself could be an ally, and that freedom often came not by fighting the system, but by letting it unravel on its own terms. The legacy of these tactics echoes in modern prison breaks, where holidays still see spikes in escape attempts. Because some truths endure across centuries, a man focused on merriment is rarely focused on duty, and in the giddy haze of celebration, even the most unbreakable locks can be left untended. For the knights who mastered this art, liberation wasn't just about strength or stealth. It was about understanding that the greatest distractions are the ones people choose for themselves. Darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a cloak, a silent partner in the delicate dance of escape. For knights held captive, the night transformed familiar prisons into alien landscapes where every shadow could hide an opportunity. The scrape of a boot against stone, the rustle of a guard's cloak, these sounds carried farther in the stillness, making each movement a calculated risk. Yet under that same hush, a prisoner might pick a lock undisturbed or slip through a courtyard unseen, his path guided by memory or the whispered directions of allies. Timing was everything. A moonless night offered near-total obscurity, but the smartest escapees knew even a clouded sky had its rhythms. A sudden bank of fog rolling in from the moat could shroud a dash to the outer walls, while the predictable interval between torch-bearing patrols created pockets of blindness. Sir Edmund de Mortimer, imprisoned in a Welsh castle during the Glyndŵr Rising, used thunderstorms to his advantage, waiting for the precise moment when lightning flashes dazzled sentries' night vision, then darting forward during the following seconds of deeper darkness. But navigating in blackness demanded more than courage. It required meticulous preparation. Knights spent daylight hours memorizing the texture of stones underfoot, counting steps between landmarks, or noting which floorboards creaked. Some rubbed charcoal on door hinges to muffle their movement, while others practiced walking heel to toe like hunters stalking prey. The most resourceful even trained their bodies to function with limited senses, closing their eyes during daytime exercises to simulate nocturnal conditions. What's striking about these nighttime escapes is how they reveal medieval warriors as masters of adaptation. These were men raised to fight in open daylight, their armor gleaming for all to see. Yet when survival demanded it, they became creatures of stealth, trading heralds' trumpets for the language of rustling leaves and distant owl calls. Their success hinged not on brute force, but on an intimate conversation with the environment, reading the wind's direction to mask sound, using the cold to justify a hood pulled low over the face, or timing their moves to the natural lulls when even guards succumbed to midnight lethargy. The legacy of these tactics endures in modern special operations, where darkness remains the oldest form of camouflage. But for medieval knights, the night offered something even more precious than concealment: the gift of time. Those extra seconds between a sentry's rounds, the prolonged shadows before dawn, these weren't just moments, but the difference between a cell's despair and the sweet ache of freedom's first breath. And in that balance, they proved that sometimes the most powerful ally isn't a sword or a shield, but the simple, ancient comfort of the dark. Faith was more than a refuge in the dungeon's gloom. It could be a weapon, sharpened by desperation and wielded with cunning. For knights imprisoned during the medieval era, the line between piety and strategy often blurred. Some knelt in fervent prayer, seeking divine deliverance, while others turned their captors' own superstitions against them, weaving tales of curses and portents to erode the resolve of even the steeliest guards. In a world where omens were taken as seriously as armed threats, a whispered prophecy or a well-timed accident could unravel the discipline of an entire garrison. Take the escape of Sir William Montagu from a French prison in the 14th century. Knowing his jailers feared the supernatural, he staged an elaborate ruse, scattering salt in the shape of a cross outside his cell, then feigning terror when guards discovered it. His frantic warnings of divine wrath spread like wildfire, especially after he predicted the sudden illness of a cruel jailer. Within days, superstitious sentries avoided his cell altogether, giving him the space to pick his locks undisturbed. His performance was so convincing that local priests were summoned to bless the dungeon, leaving doors unguarded in the chaos. Religious symbols themselves became tools of deception. A stolen rosary might be reconfigured into makeshift lockpicks, while the wax from devotional candles could mold impressions of keys. Some knights even exploited the sanctity of chapel visits, knowing guards would lower their vigilance in holy spaces. One recorded escape involved a captive scribbling false scripture verses on his cell wall, verses that, when read aloud by a literate guard, revealed coded instructions for allies outside. Faith in these moments wasn't just solace, it was a language only the desperate could fluently speak, but the most profound power of belief lay in its ability to sustain hope. Chroniclers tell of knights who marked time by carving psalms into stone, their hands bleeding but their spirits unbroken. The act wasn't merely devotional, it was defiance, a way to assert humanity in a place designed to strip it away. When physical strength faltered, faith became the inner compass guiding them toward freedom, whether through divine intervention or their own orchestrated miracles. These stories remind us that escapes weren't always about muscle or metal. Sometimes the most potent force was the intangible, the fear of a curse, the weight of a whispered prayer, or the unshakable conviction that no prison could hold a soul determined to be free. In the end, whether by God's hand or their own guile, these knights proved that even the darkest cells couldn't extinguish the light of belief or the ingenuity it inspired. The most patient escapes weren't measured in days or weeks. They unfolded over years, a slow unraveling of captivity where every bowed head and obedient gesture was a thread in a larger tapestry of deception. For certain knights, freedom wasn't seized in a single daring moment but cultivated like a hidden garden, tended in secret until the walls around them crumbled from sheer neglect. These men mastered the art of playing the perfect prisoner, their feigned resignation so convincing that guards eventually stopped seeing them as threats at all. Sir Thomas Malory, the very knight who would later pen Le Morte d'Arthur, spent years drifting between English prisons, his reputation as a troublemaker earning him heavier shackles each time. But in one crucial imprisonment, he adopted a new strategy: meticulous compliance. He attended chapel without complaint, praised his captors in letters home, and even offered tactical advice to his jailers during mock battles in the courtyard. Over time, their vigilance waned until one unguarded evening when Malory simply strolled out the postern gate, his years of docility having erased him from the list of prisoners to watch. The brilliance of this tactic lay in its psychological toll. Guards expected rebellion, not resignation. A knight who raged against his chains was met with iron and vigilance, but one who folded his hands and waited. He became part of the dungeon's furniture. Some prisoners took this even further, volunteering for menial tasks, scrubbing floors, mending uniforms, to earn unsupervised movement. Others, like the German knight Ulrich von Hutten, feigned illness so persistently that their eventual recovery became an excuse for increased privileges. A sudden interest in gardening might grant access to the outer walls. A talent for storytelling could secure invitations to the warden's table, where wine flowed and keys dangled carelessly from belts. Yet the greatest risk of the long game wasn't discovery, it was the erosion of one's own resolve. To smile at a captor for months on end, to swallow pride until it became second nature, demanded a discipline far beyond battlefield courage. The French knight Jean de Joinville, imprisoned after the Seventh Crusade, described it as a duel with the self, where every sunrise demanded fresh resolve not to despair. Those who succeeded often left no dramatic tales of midnight climbs or forged documents, just an empty cell one morning, and the dawning realization that the quietest prisoner had been the most dangerous of all. These escapes force us to redefine what bravery looks like. Heroism isn't always a sword thrust or a defiant shout. Sometimes it's the silent act of enduring, of bending so completely that no one notices when you finally spring back. The knights who played the long game understood a fundamental truth. Captivity is a performance, and the best way to escape the stage is to convince everyone you've forgotten how to act. A knight bursting from a prison gate was only halfway free without a horse. Even the strongest legs would soon falter under pursuit. That's why the stables became as crucial to escape plans as the dungeon itself. A stolen mount wasn't just transportation. It was a multiplier of speed, endurance, and most importantly, distance. The moment a knight swung onto a saddle, his odds of survival skyrocketed, transforming a desperate dash into a strategic retreat. But stealing a warhorse from under a garrison's nose demanded more than brute force. It required an intimate understanding of equine behavior and the rhythms of castle life. Sir William Marshall, the legendary knight who'd later become Regent of England, staged one of the most audacious horse thefts during his youth as a hostage. Held by enemy forces, he noticed the groom's habit of leaving prized destriers tethered near the tiltyard after evening exercises. Under cover of a tournament's chaos, he swapped his own shaggy Rouncey for a lord's sleek charger, its trained obedience allowing him to trot straight past drowsy sentries. By dawn, he was 30 miles away, the stolen horse's superior stamina leaving pursuers choking on his dust. The best escapees didn't just grab the nearest horse, they chose their mounts like generals picking battlegrounds. A knight might target a courser for its speed on open roads, or a sturdy palfrey for its ability to navigate wooded trails. Some even stole pack horses laden with supplies, trading immediate speed for long-term survival. The savviest prisoners studied stable routines for weeks, noting when grooms took their meals or which stallions kicked at strangers, ensuring their theft went unnoticed until it was too late. But the true genius of these escapes lay in their aftermath. A knight on horseback could exploit the medieval world's vast, unmapped wilderness, swimming rivers to break scent trails, or zigzagging through dense forests where mounted patrols struggled to follow. Some released their stolen horses after a hard ride, knowing the animals would instinctively return home, sending pursuers chasing false leads. Others, like the French knight Bertrand de Born, turned horse theft into psychological warfare, stealing his captor's favorite stallion, then taunting him in letters about its superior performance. These stories reveal a tactical truth often overlooked. In an era defined by castles and sieges, mobility remained the ultimate advantage. A knight who could outpace his enemies didn't just escape a prison, he rewrote the rules of engagement, proving that sometimes the fastest route to victory wasn't through strength of arms, but the thundering hooves of a well-chosen horse. A knight's knowledge of geography wasn't just academic. It was his lifeline, turning rivers into roads and forests into fortresses. While modern escapes rely on GPS and satellite imagery, medieval warriors had to carry entire landscapes in their minds, recalling every bend in a river or the exact spot where a mountain pass narrowed to a single-file trail. This mental mapping often began long before capture, with knights studying territories during campaigns or listening intently to merchants' tales of hidden paths. The difference between freedom and recapture could hinge on remembering whether a certain stream flowed east toward friendly lands or west into enemy strongholds. Sir John de la Pole's escape from Scottish captivity in the 14th century demonstrates this perfectly. Held in a border fortress, he'd once hunted these very hills as a young man. When he slipped his chains, he didn't flee blindly. He followed a deer trail only locals knew, one that skirted bogs and emerged near an abbey sympathetic to English knights. His captors sent hounds and trackers, but they searched the main roads while Pole moved like a shadow through terrain he'd memorized years earlier. Geography didn't just aid his escape, it became his silent accomplice. Celestial navigation offered another layer of security. Knights familiar with the North Star could maintain direction even in moonless forests, while those who recognized seasonal constellations could estimate how many hours of darkness remained. The French knight Olivier de Morny allegedly escaped a Welsh prison by following the Milky Way westward to the coast, where a fishing boat awaited. Such skills transformed the night sky from a beautiful mystery into a practical tool, as vital as any map or compass. But the most ingenious use of terrain involved turning natural obstacles into advantages. A flooded river might seem impassable unless you knew where the old Roman bridge lay submerged just inches below the surface. Dense thickets could hide a man from horsemen, while limestone caves provided shelter where no pursuer would dare follow. Some knights even exploited their captors' own knowledge gaps. In alpine regions, local guides spoke of prisoners who escaped into high pastures where outsiders feared to climb, their paths obscured by summer fog. What makes these geographic escapes remarkable is their lasting legacy. Today's survival manuals still teach many of these medieval techniques, proving that while landscapes change, the principles of navigation endure. Because when every other tool is stripped away, the mind's ability to chart a course through wilderness remains the oldest and often the most reliable path to freedom. The dungeon's silence was most terrifying after a failed escape. every returned prisoner knew the price, not just tightened chains, but the calculated cruelty meant to break their spirit. A knight dragged back to his cell bore more than bruises. He carried the knowledge that his captors would now see him as a lesson to others. Yet what's astonishing isn't the punishments they endured, but how often they risked them. For every successful escape, chronicles tell of a dozen attempts that ended in recapture, each failure met with escalating brutality. The real measure of these knights' resolve lies not in their triumphs alone, but in their willingness to stare down consequences that would make most men abandon hope. Take the harrowing case of Sir William de Ufford, seized after a botched tunnel collapse in a Norman stronghold. His captors didn't merely shackle him, they sealed him in an oubliette with his failed excavation tools, leaving him to contemplate his mistake in total darkness. The message was clear: your labor brought only deeper suffering. Yet when Ufford was finally hauled back to the main dungeon months later, his first act was to covertly pocket a loose nail from the floor. Even fresh from torment, his mind still turned toward escape. The psychological toll was often sharper than physical pain. Some jailers employed humiliation as their preferred weapon, like the Burgundian commander who forced recaptured knights to wear fool's caps and perform menial tasks in the courtyard. Others exploited familial bonds, like the Scottish lord who wrote to a prisoner's wife detailing her husband's failed escape, knowing the shame would cut deeper than any lash. These tactics reveal a chilling truth. Medieval captors understood that to truly break a knight, they had to attack not just his body, but his very identity as a warrior and leader. Yet time and again, knights defied this calculus. Sir John de Vere, recaptured 3 times during the Wars of the Roses, endured progressively harsher confinement, first stocks, then solitary, finally a cage suspended from a castle's ceiling. Each time he was released back into general holding, he immediately began plotting anew. His jailers couldn't comprehend it. Why risk starvation or mutilation when comfortable ransom was possible? The answer lies in something deeper than strategy. For these men, captivity wasn't just a physical state, it was an existential threat to who they were. A knight who stopped attempting escape, even in the face of horrific consequences, had already surrendered something far more precious than his freedom. These stories force us to confront an uncomfortable reality: that history's most inspiring escapes are inseparable from the specter of failure. The darkness of the dungeon isn't just a backdrop, it's what makes the light of liberation so blinding. When we admire a knight's daring breakout, we're also honoring the countless untold attempts that ended in chains, the ones who paid the price so others could learn. Their legacy isn't just in the successes, but in the unbroken will that made success possible. Because in the end, the greatest risk wasn't the torture awaiting failure, it was the spiritual death of never trying at all. History remembers Richard the Lionheart's escape from captivity as a masterclass in royal subterfuge, but the truth is even more remarkable. Captured by Duke Leopold of Austria in the late 12th century, the famed king wasn't busting through gates or scaling walls. He was slipping past guards disguised as a humble merchant, his face obscured by a hood, his regal bearing hidden beneath the stooped posture of a tradesman. The audacity of it still stuns. Europe's most recognizable monarch, vanishing into the night because his captors never considered he'd lower himself to such a disguise. Yet this was no impulsive act. Richard's escape was a meticulously planned operation involving coded messages, bribed servants, and even a strategically arranged hunting party to draw guards away from his route. His story isn't just about bravery, it's about understanding that the greatest power often lies in appearing powerless. But for every famous escape like Richard's, there are a dozen lesser-known feats just as daring. Take the case of Elena of Aquitaine's uncle, Raymond of Antioch, who staged his own death to flee a Saracen prison in the 12th century. After weeks of feigning illness, he collapsed during a courtyard exercise, his body smeared with pig's blood hidden in a sponge. Guards, convinced he'd perished, tossed his corpse onto a refuse cart only for Raymond to spring free once the cart rolled beyond the city gates. The brilliance of his ruse. It exploited his captors' cultural aversion to handling the dead, turning their own customs into his salvation. Then there's the curious tale of Sir John Oldcastle, the Lollard knight who turned his heresy trial into an escape opportunity. Condemned in the Tower of London in the 15th century, he used his final confession to request a private prayer session in the chapel. Guards, eager to secure a last-minute repentance, left him unattended, not realizing he'd soared through his manacles days earlier using a smuggled file. By the time they discovered his empty cell, he'd already melted into London's labyrinthine alleys, his piety as much a performance as his later rebellion. What unites these stories isn't just their creativity, but their deep understanding of human psychology. The best escapes weren't about overpowering systems, they were about outthinking them. When the Welsh knight Owain Glyndwr vanished from English custody in the early 15th century, he didn't rely on force. He exploited his captors' bureaucratic complacency. By bribing a clerk to alter the prisoner log, he ensured guards didn't even realize he was missing for 3 days, giving him a head start no chase could overcome. These legendary escapes leave us with a provocative question. Was freedom won by the knights who fought hardest, or by those who understood their enemies best? The answer, etched into history's margins, suggests true cunning isn't measured in muscle, but in the willingness to see every constraint as a puzzle waiting to be solved. And sometimes the most enduring victories aren't those shouted from battlements, but those whispered in the dark before slipping silently away. While knights dominate the tales of medieval escapes, history often overlooks the women who turned the gears of their liberation: noblewomen smuggling lockpicks in bread loaves, laundresses stitching maps into linens, even tavern girls memorizing guard rotations as they served ale. These women operated in the margins, wielding influence not through brute force, but through their ability to move unnoticed in a world that dismissed them as background players. Take the case of Lady Margaret de Lacy, who orchestrated her husband's escape from a Welsh prison in the 13th century. While visiting under the guise of delivering clean garments, she concealed a wax impression of the dungeon key in her veil. Later, she had a duplicate forged and baked into a pie's crust delivered by a clumsy servant who accidentally dropped it near her husband's cell. The plan relied on the guard's assumption that women's hands were too delicate for treachery. Servants, especially those in castles, became masters of subtle sabotage. A kitchen maid might leave a cellar door unlocked during her rounds, while a seamstress could weaken the stitching of a prisoner's bonds just enough to fray over time. Their actions reveal a quiet rebellion, women with no titles or armor exploiting the very invisibility society imposed on them. In one recorded escape from a French fortress, a scullery girl named Alay used her daily chore of dumping slop into the moat to chart its shallowest crossing point, later guiding a knight through the muck under cover of fog. Her reward, not a single chronicle mentions her name, only a passing reference to a servant's aid. Even women outside prison walls played crucial roles. Midwives traveling between villages carried coded messages in their herb pouches, while noblewomen hosting feasts for enemy commanders loosened tongues with wine and extracted troop movements. The Countess of Salisbury once smuggled a night out in a wool cart, her high status ensuring guards wouldn't dare search her belongings. These women didn't just assist escapes, they engineered them, leveraging societal expectations as deftly as any sword. The true tragedy lies in how their stories were erased. Male chroniclers glorified knights daring leaps from towers, but rarely recorded the hands that lowered the ropes or the voices that sang to cover the scrape of a file. Yet without these women, many legendary escapes would have ended at the dungeon door. Their legacy whispers a provocative truth. In an era that celebrated masculine heroism, freedom often depended on the cunning of those deemed powerless. And perhaps that's why their contributions unsettled the medieval world so deeply. They proved that chains could be broken not just by strength, but by the unshakable resolve of those everyone underestimated. Breaking free from the dungeon was only the first heartbeat of liberty. What came next would test a knight's resolve just as fiercely. Imagine stumbling into the wilderness, your body weakened by months of confinement, your once fine clothing reduced to rags, with every shadow potentially hiding a patrol or a peasant eager to claim the bounty on your head. The euphoria of escape quickly collided with the brutal arithmetic of survival. No food, no allies, and miles of hostile territory between you and safety. For every knight who celebrated his newfound freedom, another found himself facing a cruel paradox. The world outside the prison walls could be just as lethal. Take the harrowing journey of Sir Robert Knowles after his escape from a Breton fortress in the 14th century. He'd pried open a sewer grate and slithered through filth to freedom, only to emerge into a winter landscape stripped bare by war. For 12 days, he lived on bark and stolen eggs, dodging search parties by day and sleeping in frozen ditches by night. His greatest threat wasn't recapture, it was the land itself. Frostbite gnawed at his fingers and hunger twisted his thoughts into hallucinations. By the time he stumbled into an English-held village, he was more corpse than man, his survival hinging on a single stroke of luck. A sympathetic farmer's wife who recognized the fleur-de-lis scar on his shoulder. But nature wasn't the only hunter. Knights on the run had to navigate a labyrinth of human loyalties. A seemingly friendly innkeeper might send word to the local garrison before the soup cooled. Even religious houses, traditional sanctuaries, could be traps like the Cistercian abbey that betrayed Sir Giles d'Argenton to French forces in the 13th century, luring him in with promises of sanctuary before slamming the gates shut. The smartest escapees trusted no one, adopting the guise of pilgrims or lepers to repel curiosity. Some went further, like the German knight who smeared himself with mud and walked barefoot for miles, playing the part of a madman so convincingly that villagers crossed themselves and hurried away rather than engage him. The journey home often demanded more than endurance, it required reinvention. A knight couldn't simply announce himself at the next castle. His very identity was a liability. Sir Thomas Dagworth, fleeing Burgundian captors in the 15th century, joined a band of traveling actors, his sword arm hidden beneath a fool's motley. For weeks he danced on tabletops and sang bawdy ballads, using the troops' movement to cover his gradual progress toward Calais. His captors searched for a nobleman, not a laughingstock in jingling bells, a lesson in humility that likely saved his life. And then there were the betrayals that cut deepest, the squire who'd sworn loyalty only to sell your location for a handful of silver, the wife who'd remarried convinced you were dead. The liege lord who questioned whether you'd broken under torture and returned as a spy. Freedom wasn't a triumphant return to the way things were, it was a reckoning with all that had changed in your absence. The French knight Jean de Carouge discovered this bitterly after his escape from Moorish pirates in the late 14th century. His estates had been divided, his title contested, and his wife nearly wed to his cousin. The legal battle to reclaim his life lasted years, proving that some chains couldn't be picked with a lockpin. Yet these stories of post-escape survival reveal something profound about the medieval mindset. A knight's training wasn't just for battle, it was for the long, lonely walk home. The same discipline that let him hold formation in a charge also helped him count his steps through a pitch-dark forest. The courtly manners drilled into him became tools to charm a suspicious farmer into offering bread. Even the heraldry on his surcoat, if hidden wisely, could one day be revealed to prove his identity. Every skill had a dual purpose, just as every hardship carried a lesson. The true measure of these escapes lies not in the moment the prison door creaked open, but in the days and weeks that followed, when freedom meant not just breathing open air, but outlasting the world's indifference. Because in the end, the strongest steel wasn't forged in the smithy, but in the slow, relentless pressure of the grindstone. And for these knights, every step toward home was another turn of the wheel, shaping them into something even their captors couldn't break. The glowing tapestries of medieval literature often embroidered daring prison breaks with golden threads of heroism, turning gritty reality into shimmering legend. Chroniclers and poets alike couldn't resist embellishing escapes, adding secret passageways that defied architecture, or noble captors who conveniently dozed at the perfect moment. Take the famous account of Tristan and Isolde, where the lover's flight from King Mark's tower is aided by a miraculously placed bed of leaves to cushion their fall. Such flourishes weren't just entertainment, they reinforced cultural ideals of courtly cunning and divine favor, blurring the line between history and fantasy. Yet behind these romanticized versions lay kernels of truth. The 12th century chronicler Gerald of Wales described a Welsh prince's escape by pretending to be dead, a tale eerily similar to Raymond of Antioch's pig's blood ruse. Did Gerald embellish the story, or was this a genuine tactic passed down through oral tradition? The ambiguity reveals a deeper truth. Medieval audiences craved narratives where wit triumphed over brute force, and storytellers happily obliged. Escapes became moral fables, teaching that brains could outmatch brawn, especially when God smiled on the virtuous. This literary lens distorts our view of actual prison breaks. Manuscript illustrations often show knights descending towers on silken ropes, their postures graceful as dancers, never the bloodied hands or snapped cords of real attempts. The Chanson de Roland transforms Charlemagne's nephew from a probable hostage negotiator into a swashbuckling escape artist, reinforcing the era's obsession with individual heroism. Even legal documents weren't immune. Court scribes might record a knight's flight as miraculous, to avoid admitting their lord's security failures. The most fascinating distortions emerge in saintly escapes. When hagiographies described holy men walking through locked doors or having their chains melted like wax, they weren't just praising divine intervention, they were weaponizing storytelling against captors. A reputation for miraculous escapes could deter imprisonment altogether, as few jailers wanted to tempt heaven's wrath. This spiritual spin created a feedback loop. The more such tales spread, the more prisoners and poets borrowed their tropes, until even mundane breaks acquired a whiff of the supernatural. Modern historians face a delicate task sifting through these layers of myth. The Chronicle of Melrose Abbey claims a Scottish knight vanished from his cell with nary a sound, leaving behind a single rose, an obvious allegory. But cross-referencing with tax rolls reveals the real story. The knight's family bribed the abbot, who staged the miracle to avoid angering the king. Such discoveries remind us that every romantic escape in medieval literature whispers a hidden truth about power, propaganda, and the timeless human urge to turn survival into legend. What endures isn't just the fiction or the fact, but the collision between them. These stories shaped how knights saw themselves, how captors treated prisoners, even how laws were written. A nobleman who'd grown up hearing of Tristan's exploits might attempt riskier escapes, believing destiny favored the bold. Conversely, jailers who feared divine retribution might grant clemency. The legacy of these tales lingers in our collective imagination, where the idea of a medieval escape still conjures silk ropes and sleeping guards, proof that history isn't just written by the victors, but by the bards who turned their struggles into song. The desperate scrape of a rusted spoon against dungeon stone finds its echo in the muffled clicks of a modern prisoner filing through handcuffs. Those centuries-separate medieval knights from 21st century POWs, the raw calculus of escape remains startlingly similar. Where there's captivity, there will always be minds scheming against it. Consider the parallels between Sir William de Morisco's feigned illness in 13th century Wales and Admiral Jeremiah Denton's coded blinking during a 1966 North Vietnamese propaganda film. Both men weaponized their captors' assumptions, one playing weak to lower guards' vigilance, the other using Morse code eyelashes to spell "Torture" for the world to see. The tools change, but the playbook endures. Digging deeper reveals even more striking overlaps. Medieval knights counting guard rotations mirror Allied pilots in Colditz Castle tracking Nazi patrol schedules with smuggled watches. The knotted bedsheet rope lowered from a tower in 1380 isn't so different from the woven wire cables used in the 1943 Italian POW camp breakout, immortalized in The Great Escape. And when French knight Bertrand du Guesclin bribed a homesick guard with promises of land, he employed the same psychological leverage as Vietnam POW James Stockdale, who turned his jailer's ideological doubts into covert assistance. Time hasn't dulled the fundamentals, it's simply swapped parchment maps for hand-drawn ones, carrier pigeons for tapped radio signals. What truly binds these eras together isn't just methodology, but motivation. When medieval chroniclers described knights enduring torture rather than revealing escape routes, their words could easily apply to WW2 resistance fighters swallowing cyanide capsules to protect comrades. The 12th century Song of Roland praises heroes who choose death before dishonor, a creed later embodied by soldiers like Dieter Dengler, who survived Laos jungles after his 1966 helicopter crash by clinging to the same stubborn defiance that fueled castle dungeon breakouts. This unbroken thread suggests something profound. The will to resist confinement isn't taught by any manual, but woven into human nature itself. Yet technology's march has altered the stakes. Where a medieval knight might spend months scratching a tunnel with a spoon, modern prisoners face motion sensors and thermal cameras, but ingenuity adapts. The crude wax key impressions of yesteryear have become 3D printed replicas based on smuggled smartphone photos. Escape routes once plotted by starlight now utilize hacked drone footage. Even the ancient art of disguise has upgraded. Special forces training includes gate masking techniques that would make Sir Reginald de Warenne's laundress impersonation look elementary. Perhaps the most poignant parallel lies in aftermath. Just as recaptured medieval knights faced tightened chains or public humiliation, modern escapees like POW Shalit endured solitary confinement after his 2006 tunnel breakout from Gaza militants. And like their armored ancestors, today's prisoners often find that true freedom begins only after the physical escape, navigating PTSD, societal reintegration, and the haunting question of what was sacrificed in the name of survival. These shared struggles reveal that liberation is never just about crossing a wall or cutting a fence. It's about outlasting the invisible prisons that linger long after the locks snap open. The through line across 8 centuries isn't just tactics or terrain, but something more elemental. The understanding that every prison, whether built of Norman stone or razor wire, is ultimately a contest of minds. When a Ukrainian pilot today studies his captors' routines with the same intensity as a 14th century French knight, he's not just continuing a tradition, he's proving that certain truths transcend time. Oppression breeds invention, despair fuels creativity, and no cage, no matter how advanced, can fully contain the human spirit's refusal to accept defeat. The faces change, the fortresses evolve, but the fire remains the same. Beneath the romanticized tales of knights and their daring escapes lies a layer of cold, hard-proof etchings in stone, fragments of rope, the faint outlines of long collapsed tunnels. Archaeology doesn't just confirm these stories, it often rewrites them entirely. Take the discovery in 2019 at Château-de-Caussy, where ground-penetrating radar revealed a narrow passage beneath the dungeon, its walls scored with systematic scratches, not random wear but the deliberate marks of tools. This wasn't a forgotten drain, it was a painstakingly carved escape route, its existence corroborating a local legend about a captive knight who vanished like a ghost in 1387. Graffiti offers another silent testimony. In the Tower of London's Salt Tower, infrared imaging recently uncovered a crude carving of a horse beneath layers of whitewash. To the untrained eye, it's mere vandalism, but historians recognize it as the personal emblem of Sir Thomas Beauchamp, imprisoned there in 1397. The position near a barred window overlooking the Thames suggests it wasn't idle doodling, but a signal to allies on passing boats. Beauchamp's eventual escape, long attributed to bribery, now seems far more tactical, a coordinated effort hinted at by this centuries-old mark. Even discarded objects tell stories. A rusted belt buckle unearthed near the ruins of Berg Eltz in Germany might seem insignificant until you notice its uneven wear. Forensic analysis showed one side had been deliberately filed to a sharp edge, a makeshift lockpick or weapon, paired with castle records noting the mysterious disappearance of a Flemish knight in 1422. The buckle transforms from trash to evidence, revealing how prisoners repurposed the very items meant to restrain them. Perhaps the most startling finds are the ones that upend historical assumptions. For decades, scholars dismissed accounts of flying escapes from high towers as pure fiction. Then, in 2011, archaeologists at Mont Saint Mitchell discovered braided fibers embedded in mortar near a tower window, remnants of a rope made from torn clothing and straw. Carbon dating placed it squarely in the 1450s, coinciding with the recorded escape of the Breton knight Jean de Courvenal. Suddenly, what sounded like a bard's exaggeration became a tangible feat of engineering. These discoveries do more than validate old tales, they expose the gaps in our knowledge. Every time a trowel uncovers a hidden hinge or a child's toy repurposed as a digging tool, it's a reminder that history's most ingenious escapes may have left no written record at all. The true number of successful breakouts could dwarf what chronicles describe, lost to time but preserved in the quiet language of disturbed soil and weathered stone. What emerges from these excavations isn't just a collection of artifacts, but a deeper understanding of resilience. A knife-scratched calendar on a cell wall speaks of meticulous patience. A tunnel's zigzag path reveals strategic thinking, digging at angles to avoid detection by sound. These weren't acts of desperation, but calculated campaigns, each scratch and stitch a silent manifesto of defiance. As technology peels back layers of plaster and dirt, we're not just finding evidence of escapes, we're recovering the blueprints of hope itself, drawn by hands that refuse to accept despair. The next breakthrough might lie waiting beneath a tourist's footsteps or behind a museum display, because for every knight whose story was celebrated, there were a dozen more who slipped through history's cracks, their methods known only to the earth that hid them. And with each archaeological revelation, we're reminded that the past isn't static. It's a puzzle still being solved, one shovelful at a time. These escape stories aren't just thrilling adventures from a distant past, they're a mirror reflecting the unyielding human instinct to resist oppression, no matter the odds. Every scratched tunnel, every forged disguise, every whispered alliance echoes a truth that transcends time. When faced with confinement, whether physical or psychological, people will always seek a path to freedom. Consider Sir William Marshall's calculated patience or Elena of Aquitaine's covert networks. Their methods may be medieval, but their defiance resonates with anyone who's ever felt trapped, whether by walls, circumstance, or even societal expectations. What makes these narratives so enduring isn't just their drama, but their universality. A knight picking a lock with a spoon isn't so different from a political prisoner smuggling messages in bread, or a modern whistleblower circumventing surveillance. The tools change, but the essence remains a refusal to let external constraints define internal freedom. Historians often frame these escapes as acts of survival, and they were. But dig deeper and you'll find something more profound, a reclamation of identity. For knights, captivity wasn't just about lost liberty, it was an assault on their very purpose as warriors and leaders. Breaking free wasn't merely a physical act, it was a declaration that their captors couldn't erase who they were. This defiance reverberates through history's darkest chapters. The same ingenuity that fueled medieval escapes reappeared in World War II prison camps, Cold War spy swaps, and even today's digital age, where activists use encryption as their tunnels and firewalls as their moats. The parallels reveal a timeless pattern. Oppression breeds creativity. When authority says no, the human spirit invents 1,000 ways to say yes. Yet these stories also caution against romanticizing struggle. For every successful escape, countless others ended in brutal retaliation, a reminder that resistance carries real cost. The Welsh prince Owain Glyndwr's legendary vanishing act came only after years of failed rebellions and personal tragedy. His ultimate escape wasn't just from an English prison, but from history itself, his fate unknown. These tales aren't just about victory, they're about the price of defiance and the quiet courage of those who keep trying despite the risks. Ultimately, what lingers isn't the spectacle of escape, but its symbolism. A knight's flight from a dungeon mirrors our own battles against invisible cages, whether toxic relationships, systemic injustice, or self-doubt. The medieval world may have traded parchment for pixels, but the core lesson endures: freedom isn't given. It's carved out of the dark, one stubborn act of hope at a time. And in that struggle, these long-dead knights become unlikely guides, proving that even the heaviest chains can be broken, if only we refuse to stop pulling at them. Centuries may separate us from those medieval knights, but their daring escapes whisper lessons that feel startlingly modern. The same qualities that let a prisoner pick locks with a spoon, resourcefulness, patience, and relentless problem-solving, are the very skills that define success in today's world. Think about it: when a knight memorized guard rotations or mapped a dungeon's weak points, he wasn't just plotting a breakout, he was mastering the art of situational awareness. That's no different from a startup founder analyzing market gaps, or a doctor diagnosing a rare illness by piecing together subtle clues. History's greatest escapers didn't just flee, they observed, adapted, and turned constraints into advantages, a mindset as valuable in boardrooms as it was in dungeons. Take adaptability. The knight's ability to swap armor for a beggar's rags mirrors the modern professional pivoting careers in a shifting economy. Consider Sir Reginald de Warenne's laundress disguise. His survival hinged on shedding pride and embracing a role beneath his station. That lesson echoes today when tech workers retrain for green energy jobs, or artists leverage AI tools rather than resisting them. The medieval world punished rigidity, so does ours. Those prisoners who thrived weren't the strongest, but the most fluid, like the knight who used his captivity to learn his enemy's language, foreshadowing today's global leaders who bridge cultures. Courage, too, takes unexpected forms. We often picture bravery as sword-swinging heroics, but the escapes that truly inspire involve quieter grit, the kind shown by knights who endured years of false compliance to earn their captors' complacency. That's the same steadfastness fueling modern activists who chip away at injustice through small, daily acts of defiance. When Sir Thomas Malory played the model prisoner for months before walking free, he demonstrated what psychologists now call strategic endurance, the ability to delay gratification for a greater goal. It's the quality shared by scientists laboring decades on a breakthrough, or refugees rebuilding lives in foreign lands. Perhaps the most timeless lesson is the power of collaborative cunning. No knight escaped alone, whether through bribed guards, peasant guides, or coded messages from loved ones. Their networks functioned like medieval versions of today's grassroots movements or open-source communities, where trust and shared purpose overcome centralized control. The Welsh rebels who smuggled tools inside hollowed-out loaves weren't so different from journalists using encrypted apps to bypass censorship. Both prove that oppression's greatest weakness isn't its strength, but its inability to stamp out human connection. These stories also caution against underestimating adversity. A knight's first escape plan often failed, tunnels collapsed, disguises frayed, bribes were betrayed. Yet the ones who ultimately succeeded viewed each setback as data, refining their approach like a modern engineer iterating prototypes. That iterative resilience defines today's innovators, from astronauts troubleshooting Mars rovers to teachers adapting lessons for neurodiverse students. The medieval mindset wasn't, if at first you don't succeed, it was, if the seventh tunnel collapses, dig an eighth. What makes these parallels so urgent isn't just their practicality, but their reminder of our shared humanity. The fear in a knight's gut as he lowered himself into a freezing moat is the same pulse-racing anxiety before a public speech or a medical test. His triumph, that first gulp of free air, mirrors the euphoria of landing a dream job or surviving illness. By studying how they overcame, we're not just learning history, we're inheriting a toolkit for our own battles, whether against literal walls or the invisible barriers of bias, burnout, or self-doubt. Their greatest legacy isn't in how they escaped dungeons, but in how they teach us to dismantle our own. From shadowy tunnels to moonlit rides, the escapes of captured knights reveal something far deeper than clever tricks. They show us the unbreakable human spirit. These weren't just feats of physical endurance, they were masterclasses in problem-solving, where every rusted nail or loose stone became a tool, every guard's habit a potential weakness to exploit. Think of Sir William de Ufford, sealed in an oubliette after a failed tunnel collapse, yet still pocketing a stray nail to begin anew. Or Elena of Aquitaine's uncle, Raymond of Antioch, smearing himself in pig's blood to play dead, turning his captors' superstitions against them. These stories resonate because they're not relics of the past, they're blueprints for resilience. What's striking is how these medieval escapes mirror modern struggles. A knight memorizing guard rotations isn't so different from a student mastering a complex skill through disciplined practice. The patience of a prisoner slowly fraying rope from his bedding echoes the perseverance of an entrepreneur refining a product through countless iterations. Even the Alliance's knights forged bribing guards, charming servants remind us that no one achieves greatness alone. Collaboration and trust remain as vital today as they were in candlelit dungeons. But perhaps the most enduring lesson lies in how these knights redefined limitations. A barred window wasn't just an obstacle, it was a potential exit. A jailer's cruelty could be weaponized into carelessness. By reframing their circumstances, they transformed despair into strategy. That mindset, seeing opportunity where others see dead ends, is as relevant now as ever. Whether facing personal setbacks or societal challenges, their stories whisper a timeless truth. Constraints are often illusions waiting to be dismantled. As the echoes of these escapes linger, they invite us to reflect on our own battles. What metaphorical dungeons are we navigating? What tools lie hidden in plain sight? The knights didn't just escape stone walls, they shattered the expectation of defeat. And in that defiance, they left a legacy far greater than their individual feats, proof that ingenuity and courage can rewrite even the most hopeless narratives. If these tales have sparked your imagination, we'd love to hear which escape resonated most with you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. History's greatest adventures are best when shared. And for more journeys into the past, don't forget to subscribe. The next chapter of history's daring exploits is just a click away, waiting to inspire your own modern-day breakthroughs. After all, the past isn't just a story, it's a challenge to rise, adapt, and conquer.